Hi, I'm Maya. For 30 years, I believed that keeping quiet and letting others shine was the path to family harmony. I thought supporting from the shadows made me the good daughter, the reliable sister, the one who could always be counted on. I was wrong, dead wrong. Because on my 30th birthday, while my sister Jessica announced her engagement to my business partner, I discovered that sometimes the person you trust most is the one plotting your downfall. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply telling the truth about who really owns what. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the windows of my downtown Portland loft like a gray silk curtain, filtering the October sunlight into something soft and forgiving. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, coffee mug warming my hands, watching the city wake up beneath me, 30 years old today. The number felt both significant and hollow, like a milestone that should mean something but somehow didn't. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop, breaking the peaceful silence. A text from Jessica, my younger sister by 3 years. "Happy birthday, sis. Can't wait for tonight. Mom's making your favorite cake." The message was followed by a string of heart emojis that felt performative rather than genuine, but I pushed that cynical thought away. Jessica had always been the more expressive one, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries with elaborate gestures, while I preferred quiet acknowledgments. I typed back a simple thank you and set the phone aside, returning my attention to the view. The Pearl District stretched out below me, a testament to urban renewal and the tech boom that had transformed this corner of Oregon into something resembling Silicon Valley North. My company, CloudSync Solutions, had offices just 6 blocks away in a converted warehouse that still smelled faintly of the coffee beans that had once been stored there. We specialized in cloud storage solutions for small to medium businesses, and after 5 years of grinding through 18-hour days and weekend debugging sessions, we were finally seeing real success. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could afford this penthouse loft while my parents still lived in the same modest Beaverton ranch house where Jessica and I had grown up. They insisted they were happy there, that the mortgage was almost paid off, that they didn't need anything fancy. But I knew better. I knew that my father's contracting business had never fully recovered from the 2008 recession, and that my mother's part-time job at the local library barely covered their monthly expenses. The subtle ways they economized, the careful navigation, around topics like vacation plans or home repairs, the gratitude that felt almost embarrassed when I quietly paid for things like new appliances or car maintenance. Unlike the original story I'd heard about financial manipulation, my situation was different. I genuinely wanted to help my family, and I had the means to do it without sacrificing my own stability. What I hadn't expected was how invisible my contributions would become, how quickly my parents would begin to see my success as somehow belonging to the entire family, rather than something I had built with my own hands and mind. Jessica worked in marketing for a mid-sized advertising firm downtown, a job she'd landed straight out of college and seemed content to coast in. She was good at it, certainly better than I would have been at managing client relationships and creating campaigns. But there was a restlessness in her lately, a dissatisfaction that came out in pointed comments about how some people got lucky with timing and opportunity. She never said it directly, but the implication was clear. She believed my success was a matter of being in the right place at the right time, rather than the result of working 7 days a week for years. The truth was more complicated. CloudSync hadn't been my idea alone. David Martinez, my business partner and the company's CEO, had approached me 3 years into my previous job at a larger tech firm. He'd been working on cloud infrastructure solutions and needed someone with my background in data security and system architecture. We'd met at a tech conference in Seattle, bonded over our shared frustration with the bureaucracy of large corporations, and decided to take the leap together. What David didn't know, what no one in my family knew except for my lawyer and accountant, was that I owned 65% of CloudSync Solutions. On paper, it looked like an even partnership, but the reality was more nuanced. I had provided not just the technical expertise, but also the initial funding, the connections that had secured our first major contracts, and the security protocols that had become our main selling point. David was brilliant at the business side, at sales and marketing and public relations, but the company's core technology was mine. I'd structured it this way deliberately, preferring to let David be the public face while I focused on the work I loved. It had seemed like the perfect arrangement. He got to be the charismatic CEO who gave interviews and pitched to investors, while I could spend my time in the code, in the architecture, in the technical challenges that actually excited me. The disparity in ownership reflected the disparity in contribution, though David believed we were equal partners splitting everything 50-50. The deception wasn't malicious, at least not initially. I'd simply never corrected his assumption, and as the company grew more successful, it became harder to bring up, especially after he started dating my sister. Jessica and David had met at CloudSync's 3rd anniversary party last year. I'd watched them circle each other all evening, Jessica drawn to his confidence and public success, David charmed by her social ease and family connection to me. They'd seemed like a natural fit, both outgoing and ambitious in ways I wasn't, both comfortable in crowds and skilled at small talk. I'd been happy for them, genuinely pleased that two people I cared about had found each other. What I hadn't anticipated was how their relationship would shift the dynamics within my own family. Suddenly, David was at every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual barbecue. He charmed my parents effortlessly, telling stories about the company's growth and future plans that made it sound like he was single-handedly building an empire. My mother would listen with rapt attention as he described meetings with potential investors or partnerships with larger firms, while my father nodded approvingly at his business acumen. I didn't mind sharing the spotlight. I'd never wanted it anyway. But I began to notice how conversations about CloudSync's success increasingly centered around David's vision and leadership, with my contributions mentioned only in passing, if at all. Jessica would beam proudly as she introduced him as my boyfriend, who runs a tech company, while I sat quietly at the table, apparently just another employee lucky enough to work for such an innovative leader. The shift was subtle but persistent. At family gatherings, questions about my work became questions about David's company. My parents' pride in my success became pride in their potential son-in-law's achievements. Even my own accomplishments were reframed through the lens of his generosity in giving me such opportunities. When I'd received a Technology Innovation Award from the Oregon Business Journal 6 months ago, my father's response was to clap David on the back and say, "You must be proud of the team you've built." I told myself it didn't matter. The work was what mattered, not the recognition. The company's success was what mattered, not who got credit for it. But late at night in my loft, staring out at the city lights, I'd feel a familiar ache of invisibility that I'd been carrying since childhood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica had always been the one who got noticed, who commanded attention effortlessly, who seemed to exist in full color while I remained a background figure in grayscale. The morning passed quietly as I prepared for the evening's celebration. My parents had insisted on hosting the party at their house, claiming it would be more intimate and meaningful than a restaurant. Jessica had volunteered to handle the planning, which meant I had no idea what to expect beyond my mother's promise of chocolate cake and my father's assurance that he'd keep the guest list small. I spent the afternoon at the office, catching up on code reviews and responding to client emails. The CloudSync team was small but dedicated, 12 people total, including David and myself. Most of them had worked with me for years, had been part of the late-night debugging sessions and weekend launches that had built the company's reputation for reliability and security. They knew who I was, what I contributed, even if the outside world saw David as the sole architect of our success. Marcus Williams, our lead developer and my closest friend on the team, stopped by my desk around 3 o'clock. He was one of the few people who knew the real ownership structure, having been present for some of the early legal meetings that had established the company's foundation. "Birthday plans tonight?" he asked, perching on the edge of my desk with the casual familiarity of someone who'd worked alongside me for 4 years. "Family dinner," I replied, not looking up from my screen. "Jessica's handling the details." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and I could feel him studying my expression. He'd grown increasingly concerned over the past few months as David's public profile had grown and my role had become more invisible. As our head developer, he understood better than anyone how much of CloudSync's core technology bore my fingerprints, how many of our most innovative solutions had emerged from my designs and implementations. "You know," he said carefully, "it might be time to set the record straight about some things, especially with the IPO discussions heating up." I finally looked up at him, noting the concern in his dark eyes. Marcus had been pushing me for months to be more public about my role in the company, to correct the misperceptions that had grown around David's leadership. He understood the technical side better than anyone, knew that while David was an excellent CEO, the company's fundamental innovations were mine. "It's not about the credit," I said, the same response I'd been giving for months. "It's about the work." "Maya," Marcus said gently, "when the investment bankers start doing their due diligence for the IPO, they're going to want to understand the real ownership structure. They're going to want to know who actually built what. You can't stay invisible forever." He was right, of course. CloudSync was in the early stages of preparing for an initial public offering, and that process would require complete transparency about ownership, contributions, and company structure. The comfortable fiction that David and I were equal partners would have to end one way or another. But I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. The IPO was still months away, and I'd convinced myself that I had time to figure out how to handle the revelation. David had become so embedded in my family, so central to Jessica's happiness, that the truth felt like a potential bomb that could destroy more than just business relationships. "I know," I told Marcus, "but let's get through tonight first. It's just a birthday party." As I drove through the familiar streets of Beaverton that evening, I tried to shake off the weight of the day's thoughts. The suburb looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood. Tree-lined streets with modest houses and well-maintained lawns. The kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors and community events were announced on handmade flyers taped to utility poles. My parents' house sat on a corner lot, a single-story ranch with a large backyard that had hosted countless family gatherings over the years. Jessica's car was already in the driveway next to David's sleek Tesla, a reminder of the success that everyone attributed to his business acumen. I parked behind my father's pickup truck and sat for a moment, gathering the energy to perform the role of grateful birthday girl surrounded by loving family. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant smell of someone's fireplace, autumn in the Pacific Northwest at its most nostalgic. I could hear voices and laughter from the backyard, the sound of my extended family already gathered for the celebration. Through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of my mother bustling around with serving dishes, her face animated with the joy she always found in hosting family events. I grabbed the bottle of wine I'd brought and walked toward the front door, steeling myself for an evening of playing the role I'd perfected over the years. The grateful daughter, the supportive sister, the quiet partner who was content to let others shine. It was a performance I'd given so many times that I'd almost forgotten it was a performance at all. But as I reached for the doorknob, something, in Marcus's words, echoed in my mind. You can't stay invisible forever. Tonight was just a birthday party, but maybe it was also time to start becoming visible again. Maybe it was time to stop letting other people tell my story for me. I had no idea how prescient that thought would prove to be, or how dramatically this quiet family gathering would reshape everything I thought I knew about loyalty, truth, and the price of keeping secrets. As I opened the door and stepped into the warmth and noise of celebration, I was still Maya the invisible, Maya the background figure, Maya who kept the peace by keeping quiet. By the end of the night, I would be something entirely different. The warmth of my childhood home enveloped me the moment I stepped through the front door, carrying with it the familiar blend of my mother's vanilla candles and the lingering aroma of whatever elaborate meal she'd spent the day preparing. The sound of conversation and laughter drifted from the backyard, punctuated by my father's distinctive booming laugh that had served as the soundtrack to countless family gatherings throughout my life. "Maya, sweetheart, you're here!" My mother appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on the floral apron she'd worn to every special occasion for as long as I could remember. Linda Chen had the kind of timeless beauty that came from contentment, rather than maintenance, her graying hair pulled back in a simple bun and her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing me. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like flower and happiness, holding me just a moment longer than usual. "Happy birthday, my successful daughter," she murmured against my ear, and I felt that familiar pang of guilt mixed with love that seemed to define so many of my interactions with my parents. They were proud of me, genuinely proud, but their pride felt filtered through their understanding of success, which increasingly meant David's public achievements rather than my private contributions. "Thanks, Mom. Something smells incredible. In there." I handed her the wine, a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir from a vineyard we'd visited together last spring during one of the rare weekends when I'd managed to escape the office. "Your father's been manning the grill since 3 o'clock, she said with fond exasperation. "You know how he gets when Jessica puts him in charge of something important. Come on, everyone's dying to see you." She led me through the living room, past the collection of family photos that chronicled Jessica's and my progression from gap-toothed children to college graduates to the successful adults we'd ostensibly become. I paused for a moment at a recent addition to the gallery, a professional headshot of David in a crisp white shirt and confident smile. It sat prominently on the mantel next to Jessica's engagement photos from her previous relationship that had ended 2 years ago. The placement felt significant, as if David had already been welcomed into the permanent family narrative. The sliding glass door to the backyard revealed a scene that could have been lifted from a Norman Rockwell painting. If Norman Rockwell had depicted Pacific Northwest family gatherings complete with craft beer and politically correct small talk. About 20 people were scattered across the deck and lawn, a mixture of extended family and close family friends who'd known me since childhood. String lights that my father had clearly hung with engineering precision created a warm glow over the gathering, while the smell of grilled salmon and cedar plank vegetables made my stomach remind me that I'd forgotten to eat lunch. There she is, the birthday girl. Uncle Tom raised his beer in salute from his position near the grill, where he was engaged in what appeared to be serious consultation with my father about optimal cooking temperatures. Tom was my mother's younger brother, a jovial man who'd made a comfortable living in insurance and never missed an opportunity to celebrate other people's successes with genuine enthusiasm. The crowd turned toward me with a chorus of happy birthday wishes and warm smiles, and I felt myself slip into the familiar rhythm of gracious acknowledgment and deflected attention that had become second nature over the years. Aunt Carol, elegant, in her teacher's way, complimented my dress. Cousin Ryan, now working as a software engineer himself, wanted to talk shop about cloud architecture. Mrs. Patterson from next door asked about my latest travels, apparently having heard from my mother about a business conference in San Francisco that had been more work than vacation. Through it all, I found myself scanning the gathering for Jessica and David, finally spotting them near the far corner of the deck in animated conversation with my parents' neighbors, the Kowalskis. Even from a distance, I could see that something was different about my sister tonight. She practically glowed with an energy that went beyond her usual social confidence, gesturing more expressively than usual and periodically glancing toward David with a secretive smile that made my stomach clench with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. David looked every inch the successful entrepreneur he'd become, dressed in dark jeans and a casual button-down that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. His black hair was perfectly styled, and he wore the kind of easy confidence that came from being accustomed to being the most important person in any room. When he caught sight of me, his face broke into the charming smile that had undoubtedly helped secure half of CloudSync's major contracts. "Maya, happy birthday!" He strode across the deck with the purposeful energy that characterized all his movements, pulling me into a hug that felt performative rather than affectionate. "30 looks good on you. Very distinguished for a tech mogul." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me, though I doubted he intended any. In his mind, I was a talented employee who'd been fortunate enough to become his business partner, not the actual architect of the company's core innovations. The casual way he'd claimed the title of tech mogul for himself while attributing a lesser version to me was so typically David that I almost laughed. "Thanks, David. How are things going with the Meridian contract?" I asked, referencing the major client deal we'd been negotiating for months. It was a test of sorts, a way to gauge whether he'd remembered that the technical specifications for their custom security requirements had been my design. "Excellent. Excellent. We should have it locked up by next week. My presentation really seemed to resonate with their board." He launched into a detailed description of the client meeting, describing the strategic decisions and technical explanations that had supposedly won them over. What he described was indeed the approach we'd discussed, but filtered through his memory, it became a narrative of his individual brilliance rather than our collaborative effort. Jessica appeared at his side with the fluid grace of someone who'd clearly been waiting for the right moment to join our conversation. She looked radiant in a way that went beyond her usual careful attention to appearance, wearing a flowing emerald dress that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the green flecks in her hazel eyes. But there was something else, an electric excitement that seemed to vibrate just beneath her composed exterior. "Maya, you look amazing. I love that jacket on you," she said, embracing me with what felt like genuine warmth. "How does it feel to be 30? Are you having an existential crisis yet?" "Not yet," I replied with a smile that felt only slightly forced. "Give me a few hours." The three of us fell into the kind of easy conversation that had become routine at family gatherings, with David dominating the discussion, while Jessica and I provided supportive commentary and appropriate questions. He was in fine form tonight, full of stories about CloudSync's growth and future prospects that painted him as the visionary leader guiding a talented team toward inevitable success. I found myself studying Jessica as he talked, noting the way she watched him with an expression of pride and adoration that made something twist uncomfortably in my chest. "Maya, you must be so excited about the IPO plans," said Mrs. Kowalski, who'd drifted over during David's monologue about our upcoming expansion into the European market. David was just telling us about the timeline for going public. It must be thrilling to be part of such a success story. "It's definitely exciting," I replied carefully, glancing at David to see how much he'd shared about our IPO preparations. Going public was still in the early planning stages, and we'd agreed to keep the details confidential until we'd finalized our choice of investment bank and completed the preliminary financial audits. "David says you could be looking at a valuation in the hundreds of millions," Mrs. Kowalski continued with the kind of breathless excitement that people reserved for discussing other people's money. "Imagine that, from a little startup to a major corporation in just 5 years." I felt my smile grow tighter as I realized that David had been freely discussing not just our IPO plans, but also the preliminary valuation estimates that our lawyers had suggested we keep strictly confidential. The numbers were optimistic projections, based on our current growth trajectory and market position, but they were also highly speculative and subject to dramatic changes based on market conditions and investor interest. We're still in the very early stages, I said diplomatically. A lot can change between now and actually filing with the SEC. David laughed with the easy confidence of someone who'd never experienced a major business setback. Maya is always cautious about these things. That's what makes her such a valuable partner. But the fundamentals are solid, and the market timing couldn't be better. I think we're going to surprise everyone with how well this goes. The casual way he'd dismissed my caution as excessive while claiming credit for the company's strong fundamentals made my jaw clench involuntarily. Those fundamentals he was so confident about were built on the security architecture and technical innovations that I'd developed, often working alone in the office until 3 a.m, while he was out networking at industry events and startup mixers. Maya's the technical genius behind everything we do, Jessica said with what sounded like genuine admiration. I don't understand half of what she's building over there, but David's always saying how lucky he is to have her on the team. Lucky to have me on the team, as if I were an employee he'd been fortunate enough to recruit rather than the majority owner and technical founder of the company. I caught David's quick glance in my direction, a flash of something that might have been uncertainty before his confident expression returned. The conversation was interrupted by my father's announcement that dinner was ready, and the gathering began the familiar migration toward the buffet table that my mother had arranged with military precision. Robert Chen approached cooking with the same methodical attention to detail that had made him a successful contractor, and the array of perfectly grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and complimentary side dishes reflected hours of careful preparation and timing. As we filled our plates and found seats at the long table my father had constructed specifically for large family gatherings, I found myself positioned between Cousin Ryan and Aunt Carol, while Jessica and David claimed seats directly across from me. The conversation flowed easily around topics of work and weather and local politics, the comfortable rhythm of people who'd known each other for years and had learned to navigate around potentially controversial subjects. Ryan, who'd recently started working for a prominent Seattle tech firm, peppered me with questions about CloudSync's technical architecture and growth strategies. His genuine interest in the technical challenges we'd overcome was refreshing after months of conversations that focused exclusively on business metrics and market positioning. When he asked about our approach to data encryption and security protocols, I found myself relaxing into the kind of detailed technical discussion that I rarely got to have at family gatherings. The key innovation was developing a hybrid encryption system that maintains security standards while optimizing for speed, I explained, describing the breakthrough that had become CloudSync's primary competitive advantage. Most cloud storage solutions force you to choose between security and performance, but our approach allows clients to have both. That's brilliant, Ryan said with obvious admiration. How did you come up with that approach? Before I could answer, David jumped into the conversation with his own version of the development process. It was a real collaborative effort, he said smoothly. I identified the market need and the competitive opportunity, and then Maya and the team figured out how to make it work technically. That's what makes us such a strong partnership. I handle the business strategy and market positioning, while Maya focuses on the technical implementation. The casual way he'd rewritten history, positioning himself as the strategic visionary while relegating me to the role of technical implementer, made my fork pause halfway to my mouth. The hybrid encryption system had been entirely my innovation, developed during months of research and experimentation that David had barely been aware of until I'd presented him with a working prototype. But his version of events sounded plausible to anyone who didn't know the details, and it reinforced the narrative that had somehow become accepted truth about our respective contributions to the company. Maya's being modest, Jessica added with a fond smile. She's always been like that, even when we were kids. Remember how you won that state science fair in high school, but barely mentioned it to anyone? The memory she referenced was both accurate and irrelevant, but it served to reinforce the image of me as someone who preferred to work behind the scenes, while others took public credit for achievements. It was a characterization that felt increasingly suffocating as the conversation continued around the table, with various family members sharing stories and observations that painted me as the quiet, technically minded sister, while Jessica was described in terms of her social skills and relationship successes. As dinner progressed and the wine flowed more freely, the conversation took on the relaxed, storytelling quality that characterized the best family gatherings. Uncle Tom regaled us with tales from his latest fishing trip, while Aunt Carol shared updates on her most challenging students and their unexpected breakthroughs. My parents beamed with contentment at having their family gathered around their table, occasionally catching each other's eyes with the kind of wordless communication that came from 35 years of marriage. But beneath the surface warmth and familiarity, I could sense an undercurrent of anticipation that seemed to center around Jessica and David. They kept exchanging meaningful glances across the table, and Jessica had a barely contained energy that reminded me of how she'd been as a child when she was keeping a secret she was dying to share. David, meanwhile, seemed more animated than usual, his stories more elaborate, and his laughter more frequent. When my mother emerged from the kitchen carrying a chocolate layer cake blazing with 30 candles, the gathering erupted in an enthusiastic rendition of Happy Birthday that made me smile despite my growing unease about whatever Jessica was planning. The cake was a masterpiece of maternal devotion, 3 layers of dark chocolate with raspberry filling and buttercream frosting, decorated with the kind of piped flowers that my mother had learned from a cake decorating class she'd taken when Jessica and I were in elementary school. "Make a wish, sweetheart," she said as she set the cake down in front of me, her face glowing with the particular joy that came from successfully orchestrating a family celebration. I closed my eyes and tried to think of something to wish for, but my mind felt strangely blank. What did I want that I didn't already have? Professional success, financial security, the respect of my colleagues, a comfortable home, a family that loved me despite their sometimes frustrating inability to see me clearly? The traditional markers of a successful life were all present, yet something felt fundamentally missing. Some sense of authentic recognition or genuine understanding that seemed to hover just beyond my reach. When I opened my eyes and blew out the candles, the gathering applauded with the kind of enthusiasm that made me feel simultaneously loved and isolated. As my mother cut the cake and began distributing slices, I noticed Jessica fidgeting with something in her lap, her excitement now barely contained. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting through the general conversation with unusual clarity, "before we dig into this amazing cake, David and I have something we'd like to share with everyone." The table fell silent with the sudden attention. That comes when someone announces they have news. Jessica's face was radiant with barely suppressed joy, while David wore an expression of proud satisfaction that suggested he was about to be the center of positive attention. My stomach dropped with a premonition of disaster, though I couldn't have articulated exactly what I was afraid of. Jessica reached for David's hand and held it up to display a stunning solitaire diamond ring that caught the string lights and threw sparkles across the table like scattered stars. "We're engaged," she announced, her voice ringing with pure happiness. The explosion of congratulations and excited exclamations that followed seemed to come from very far away as I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the ring that represented everything I should have been happy about, and nothing I actually felt. This was wonderful news, the logical next step for a couple who clearly adored each other and had been together for over a year. This was the kind of announcement that should have filled me with joy for my sister's happiness and pride in my business partner's good fortune. Instead, all I could think about was the conversation Marcus and I had that afternoon about the IPO process and the need for complete transparency about ownership structures. All I could think about was David's casual assumption that he could make major announcements about our company's valuation and timeline without consulting me. All I could think about was how this engagement would further cement the narrative that positioned him as the successful entrepreneur who'd elevated our entire family's status. As David launched into the story of his proposal, describing the romantic dinner and carefully planned speech that had led to Jessica's acceptance, I found myself studying their faces with a detachment that felt almost clinical. They looked like a perfect couple, the kind of successful, attractive pair who'd appear in magazine spreads about Portland's rising business elite. David's dark good looks complemented Jessica's auburn beauty, and their combined confidence and social ease made them seem destined for the kind of public success that attracted admiration and envy in equal measure. But as I watched them bask in the attention and congratulations, something cold and sharp crystallized in my chest. This wasn't just about a romantic relationship anymore. This was about my sister marrying someone who was systematically erasing my contributions to the company we'd built together. This was about family gatherings where my achievements would be forever overshadowed by his presence, and my role would be permanently relegated to supportive background figure. And suddenly, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, I realized that I was done being invisible in my own life. "That's wonderful news," I heard myself saying, my voice sounding surprisingly steady despite the revolution taking place in my chest. "Congratulations to both of you. I'm sure you'll be very happy together." The words were appropriate and supportive, exactly what a loving sister and business partner should say in such a moment. But even as I spoke them, I was making calculations about IPO timelines and ownership disclosures, about the difference between David's public narrative and documented reality, about the conversation that would need to happen before this engagement proceeded much further. Because whatever happened next, it was going to happen with complete honesty about who actually owned what and who had built what with their own hands and vision. The time for comfortable fictions was over, whether David and Jessica were ready for that truth or not. The diamond on Jessica's finger caught the light again as she gestured animatedly, describing their plans for a spring wedding in the Columbia River Gorge. Her voice bubbled with the kind of infectious excitement that drew everyone into her orbit, and I watched our family lean forward with rapt attention as she painted pictures of outdoor ceremonies and mountain views and guest lists that would include Portland's rising tech elite. "We're thinking May," she continued, her hand never leaving David's as she spoke. "Something intimate but elegant, maybe 150 people. David knows so many interesting people from the business community, and I can't wait for everyone to meet our families properly." Our families. The phrase hung in the air with a weight that felt disproportionate to its simplicity. In Jessica's vision of the future, David wasn't just marrying her but becoming permanently woven into the Chen family narrative. The successful son-in-law who'd brought prosperity and prestige to our modest suburban household. The entrepreneur whose achievements would reflect well on all of us. "Have you set a date yet?" asked Aunt Carol, who'd already pulled out her phone to presumably mark her calendar for whatever they decided. "May 15th, David replied with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions and having them accepted without question. "It's a Saturday, perfect timing for people to travel if they need to, and it gives us enough time to plan properly without rushing." I found myself calculating dates in my head. May 15th was exactly 6 weeks before our projected IPO filing deadline, assuming the due diligence process stayed on schedule. 6 weeks before the investment bankers would require complete documentation of CloudSync's ownership structure and founding contributions. 6 weeks before David would discover that the company he'd been positioning himself as the primary architect of actually belonged to someone else. The conversation flowed around me as family members peppered the happy couple with questions about venues and honeymoon plans and wedding party logistics. Jessica had clearly given considerable thought to every detail, from the flowers she wanted to the musicians she'd already researched. This wasn't a spontaneous decision, but something she'd been planning and dreaming about for months, probably since the relationship had become serious enough to warrant future-oriented thinking. "Maya will be my maid of honor, of course," Jessica announced, turning to me with a smile that felt both genuine and expectant. "I can't imagine getting married without my sister standing up there with me." The automatic yes that should have emerged from my mouth stuck somewhere in my throat as I processed the implications of what she was asking. Standing up at Jessica's wedding as her maid of honor meant publicly celebrating her marriage to David. It meant giving speeches about their love and their future and their perfect partnership. It meant participating in a celebration that would further cement his position in our family while my own contributions remained invisible. "I'd be honored," I finally managed, the words feeling thick and strange on my tongue. "You know I want you to be happy." And I did want her to be happy. That was the most frustrating part of the complex emotions churning in my chest. Jessica deserved love and partnership and a future with someone who adored her. David was charming and successful and genuinely seemed to care about her welfare and happiness. Under different circumstances, I would have been thrilled to welcome him into our family. But these weren't different circumstances. These were circumstances where my business partner had systematically minimized my contributions to our shared company, while positioning himself as the primary visionary and leader. These were circumstances where my own family had begun to see my professional achievements through the lens of his generosity and leadership. These were circumstances where staying silent meant watching my life's work be attributed to someone else permanently. "We'll need to start planning soon," my mother interjected with the practical enthusiasm that had characterized her approach to every major family event throughout my childhood. "May will be here before we know it, and these things take months of preparation to do properly." "Actually," David said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in business meetings when he was about to announce a major decision, "Jessica and I were hoping the wedding could be part of a larger celebration. CloudSync's IPO should be finalized around the same time, assuming everything goes according to plan. We thought it might be nice to combine our personal happiness with our professional success." The presumption embedded in his statement hit me like a physical blow. Our professional success. As if the IPO were something he was generously allowing me to participate in, rather than the culmination of work that I had initiated, funded, and technically architected. As if the timing of his wedding were something that naturally aligned with his business achievements rather than potentially complicating the most important financial event in CloudSync's history. "That sounds wonderful," my father said with obvious pride. "Imagine that, a wedding and a public offering in the same month. Our little family is really moving up in the world. Our little family moving up in the world because of David's success." The narrative was so seductive and so wrong that I felt something snap inside my chest like a rubber band stretched beyond its breaking point. This wasn't just about business ownership or credit for technical innovations anymore. This was about my identity being systematically erased and replaced with a more convenient fiction that served everyone's interests, except my own. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment away from the table to process what was happening and decide how to respond. The hallway felt blissfully quiet after the excited chatter around the dinner table, and I stood for a moment with my back against the closed door, trying to slow my racing heart and organize my thoughts. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see Marcus's name on the screen. "Hope you're having a good birthday. Quick question about the Meridian security specs when you have a minute." Even in his brief message, Marcus was treating me as the technical authority on our most important client project, a refreshing contrast to the conversation I'd just escaped. I typed back quickly, "At family dinner. We'll call you later. Something's come up." His response came almost immediately, "Everything okay?" I stared at the question, trying to figure out how to answer it honestly. Everything was not okay, and it was getting less okay by the minute. But explaining the situation would require a conversation longer than text messages could accommodate, and I wasn't ready to articulate the full scope of what was happening until I'd figured out how to handle it myself. "We'll explain later," I wrote back, then turned off my phone and slipped it into my purse. When I returned to the table, the conversation had shifted to wedding venues and the relative merits of outdoor versus indoor ceremonies. Jessica was in her element, clearly having researched every possible option with the thoroughness that characterized her approach to any project she cared about. She'd always been a planner, someone who thought through contingencies and backup options and detailed timelines. It was one of the things I'd always admired about her, this ability to envision a future and then methodically work toward making it reality. "The Columbia River Gorge has some stunning venues," she was saying to Aunt Carol, who'd apparently volunteered to help with research and planning. "There's this place called Skamania Lodge that has panoramic views of the gorge, and Mount Hood, very Pacific Northwest, very romantic. Sounds expensive," Uncle Tom observed, with the practical concern that came from years of managing his own family's budget. "Well, fortunately, we're in a position to do something nice," David replied, with a casual confidence that made my teeth clench. "The company's been very successful and we want to celebrate properly. Jessica deserves the wedding of her dreams." The company's been very successful. Not our company, not the company we built together, but the company whose success he was personally responsible for generating. The linguistic sleight of hand was so subtle that I doubted anyone else at the table even noticed it, but it felt like a slap across the face to me. "Maya, you've been quiet," Jessica said, turning her attention to me with a slight frown of concern. "Are you feeling okay? You look a little pale." All eyes turned to me, and I felt the familiar pressure of being the center of attention when I would have preferred to remain invisible. But invisibility was what had gotten me into this situation in the first place. Years of staying quiet and letting others tell my story had created a reality where my own contributions had been forgotten or minimized. "I'm fine," I said, managing what I hoped was a convincing smile. "Just thinking about everything that's happening. It's a lot to process." "I know," Jessica said with obvious sympathy. "It must be strange to think about your little sister getting married, but you'll love having David as a brother-in-law. He thinks so highly of you, always talking about what a valuable partner you are." Valuable partner. The phrase was perfectly calculated to sound complimentary, while reinforcing the hierarchy that positioned David as the senior partner and me as the valuable but subordinate colleague. It was the kind of language that sounded generous and supportive while actually diminishing the person it was meant to praise. "Actually," I heard myself saying before I'd consciously decided to speak, "there's something I should probably mention about the company structure, especially if you're planning to time the wedding with the IPO announcement." The table fell, silent with the sudden attention that comes when someone's tone suggests important information is about to be shared. David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features before being replaced by his usual confident smile. "Oh, are we talking shop at the birthday party?" he said with a laugh that sounded slightly forced. "I'm sure everyone would rather hear about wedding plans than business details." But I could see that I had everyone's attention now, and the words that had been building inside me for months were finally ready to emerge. The comfortable fiction that had allowed David to position himself as CloudSync's primary architect was about to collide with the documented reality that I'd been too polite or too afraid to mention. "No, I think this is relevant," I continued, my voice growing steadier as I spoke. "Especially since you mentioned combining the wedding celebration with the IPO success. People should understand what that actually means." Jessica looked confused, glancing between David and me as if trying to understand what undercurrent she was detecting in our exchange. My parents and extended family seemed equally puzzled, but interested, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, even if they couldn't identify what it was. "Maya," David said, his tone carrying a warning that only I was likely to recognize, "maybe we should discuss business matters privately." "Why privately?" I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. "If we're going to be family, shouldn't everyone understand how the company actually works? Shouldn't Jessica know what she's marrying into?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see David calculating how to respond without seeming defensive or evasive. He'd built his public persona on transparency and confidence, but those qualities were harder to maintain when faced with questions about subjects he'd preferred to keep vague. "I think Maya's right," Jessica said with the kind of bright interest. That suggested she was looking forward to learning more about her fiancé's business empire. "I'd love to understand more about how CloudSync works." David's always so modest about his achievements. Modest. The word was so spectacularly inappropriate given David's actual behavior that I nearly laughed out loud. But Jessica's genuine enthusiasm and obvious pride in her fiancé's supposed modesty reminded me that she was an innocent victim in this situation, someone who'd been misled just as thoroughly as everyone else at this table. "Well," I said, settling back in my chair with the calm that comes from finally deciding to tell the truth regardless of consequences. "The first thing to understand is that CloudSync isn't exactly the company that most people think it is." David's face had gone very still, and I could see him trying to figure out how to stop me from continuing without making it obvious that he was afraid of what I might say. But it was too late for that. The truth had been waiting for this moment for too long to be derailed by social politeness or family dynamics. "What do you mean?" asked my father, leaning forward with the interest of someone who'd always been fascinated by business structures and organizational details. "I mean that while David has done an excellent job as our CEO and public spokesperson, the actual ownership and founding of the company is a bit different from what people have been told," I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my files until I found the document I was looking for. The official incorporation papers for CloudSync Solutions, filed with the state of Oregon 3 years ago, showing the true ownership percentages and founding structure that David had apparently never bothered to examine closely. "Maya," David said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "I really don't think this is the appropriate time or place for this kind of discussion." "Really?" I asked, looking around the table at my family's expectant faces. "Because it seems like the perfect time to me. Jessica's about to marry someone and she should understand what his actual role in our company is versus what he's been telling people." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and danger, and I could feel the evening balanced on a knife's edge between revelation and disaster. But for the first time in months, I felt completely aligned with my own choices and actions. Whatever happened next, it was going to happen with complete honesty about who had built what and who deserved credit for which achievements. "The truth is," I continued, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "I own 65% of CloudSync Solutions. David owns 30%, and our employee stock option pool accounts for the remaining 5%. I was the technical founder who developed our core innovations and provided the initial funding. David joined as CEO after the company was already established and has done an excellent job growing the business side, but the idea that he built or founded the company is simply not accurate." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet, and I could see everyone at the table processing the implications of what I'd just revealed. Jessica's face had gone very pale, and she was staring at David with an expression of confusion that was slowly shifting toward something that might have been betrayal. My parents looked shocked, clearly trying to reconcile this new information with everything they'd been told about David's role in the company. David himself had gone completely still, his confident facade cracking to reveal something that looked very much like panic underneath. This wasn't how he'd planned for this evening to go, and I could practically see him trying to figure out how to manage the damage I'd just inflicted on his carefully constructed narrative. "I think," I said quietly, "it's time everyone understood who actually built what and what the IPO success will really mean for each of us." The birthday party had just become something entirely different, and there was no going back to the comfortable fictions that had brought us to this moment. The truth was finally loose in the room, and it was going to reshape everything that happened next. The silence stretched across the table like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sound of wind chimes on the neighbor's porch and the soft hum of my mother's refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen. Every face around the table registered a different stage of processing what I'd just revealed, from confusion to shock to dawning comprehension. Jessica was the first to break the quiet, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maya, what are you saying? David founded CloudSync. He's told me about it dozens of times, how he started with nothing and built it into what it is today." I looked at my sister's face, seeing the genuine bewilderment there, and felt a stab of sympathy for her position. She'd fallen in love with a story as much as a person, a narrative of entrepreneurial success and visionary leadership that David had crafted so skillfully that even I had sometimes forgotten it wasn't entirely true. "I know that's what he's told you," I said gently, "but the actual documentation tells a different story." I turned my phone screen toward the table, displaying the incorporation documents that clearly showed the founding structure and ownership percentages. The legal language was dense, but the essential facts were unmistakable to anyone willing to read them carefully. David finally found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. "Maya, you're making this sound much more dramatic than it actually is. Yes, the legal structure reflects your initial investment and technical contributions, but the real value of the company has come from the business development and strategic vision that I've provided. Anyone can write code, but building a sustainable business requires a completely different skill set." The casual dismissal of my technical contributions as something that anyone can write was so breathtakingly arrogant that several people around the table actually flinched. Uncle Tom, who'd worked in technical fields his entire career, looked particularly offended by the suggestion that complex software architecture was somehow trivial or interchangeable. "Is that really what you think?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm. "That the security innovations that became our primary competitive advantage, the encryption protocols that convinced Meridian to choose us over Google and Amazon, the technical infrastructure that's allowed us to scale to thousands of clients without a single major security breach, is just something that anyone could have written?" "That's not what I meant," David backtracked quickly, clearly recognizing that he'd overplayed his hand. "Your technical work has been invaluable, obviously. I just meant that building a company requires both technical innovation and business execution, and we've both contributed to our success in different ways." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "Building a company does require both technical innovation and business execution. The question is whether the business execution you've provided justifies claiming primary credit for founding and building the entire enterprise." I pulled up another document on my phone, this one showing the timeline of CloudSync's development and major milestones. The dates were revealing in ways that David's version of our origin story had carefully obscured. CloudSync was incorporated in March 2021, I continued. 6 months before David joined the company, I'd already developed the core encryption technology, filed for 3 provisional patents, and secured our first 2 major client contracts. David came on board as CEO in September 2021, after the company was already operational and profitable. Jessica's face had gone from pale to flushed, and I could see her mind working to reconcile this timeline with everything David had told her about starting the company from scratch. My parents exchanged glances that suggested they were having similar revelations about the stories they'd been hearing for the past year. "But David said he started the company after leaving his previous job," Jessica said slowly, looking between us with growing confusion. "He said he took the risk of leaving a stable position to build something from nothing." "He did leave his previous job to join CloudSync," I confirmed. "But he joined a company that was already established and growing, not one that he founded or started. The risk he took was real, but it was the risk of joining an existing startup, not the risk of creating something from scratch." David's confident facade was crumbling visibly now, replaced by something that looked increasingly desperate. "Maya, you're being deliberately misleading. Yes, You had some early prototypes and concepts when I joined, but turning those into a real business required strategy and leadership and market development that you weren't equipped to handle on your own. The implicit insult in his statement, the suggestion that I was somehow incapable of business leadership despite having built a profitable company before he arrived, was so patronizing that I felt my carefully controlled composure begin to crack. "You're right that I needed help with the business side," I said evenly. "That's why I brought you on as CEO and gave you equity in the company. But there's a significant difference between contributing to a company's growth and claiming to have founded it. There's a difference between being a valuable team member and positioning yourself as the primary architect of someone else's work." Cousin Ryan, who'd been following the technical aspects of our conversation with obvious interest, suddenly spoke up. "Wait, Maya, are you saying you developed the hybrid encryption system before David joined the company? Because that's revolutionary technology. That's the kind of innovation that could change entire industries." "Yes," I replied simply. "I developed the core technology over the course of 18 months while working nights and weekends at my previous job. The breakthrough that made it possible came during a particularly frustrating weekend in February 2021, when I was trying to solve the latency problems that had been plaguing previous attempts at hybrid encryption." Ryan was staring at me with something approaching awe. "Do you have any idea how valuable that technology is?" "Maya, you're not just a business owner, you're a legitimate tech innovator. Your work is going to be studied in computer science programs for decades." The recognition in his voice was both gratifying and heartbreaking, representing the kind of acknowledgement that should have been routine, but had somehow become invisible in the shadow of David's public persona. It reminded me of how much I'd given up by allowing David to become the face of innovations that were fundamentally mine. "The technology is valuable," I agreed, "which is why the IPO projections are so optimistic. Investment banks aren't interested in CloudSync because of our business development or marketing strategies. They're interested because we own patents on encryption technology that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing fees alone." David was looking increasingly cornered, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked very much like panic. "Maya, I think you're overestimating the value of the technical work relative to everything else that goes into building a successful company. Patents are worthless without market execution and business development." "You're absolutely right," I said. "Patents are worthless without execution, which is why I executed. I built the company, developed the client relationships, and established the market position that you later helped to expand. But the foundation you've been claiming credit for building was already there when you arrived." I pulled up one more document, this one showing our financial records from CloudSync's early days. The numbers told a story that was even more damning than the incorporation timeline, revealing the extent to which my initial investment and early client development had established the company's viability before David's involvement. In our first 6 months of operation before David joined the company, CloudSync generated $430,000 in revenue, I read from the financial statements. We had signed contracts with Meridian Financial, Portland, State University, and 3 smaller clients, all based on demonstrations of the encryption technology and security protocols that I had developed independently. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet, heavier and more charged with implications. Everyone at the table was now fully engaged with what was unfolding, and I could see them beginning to understand the scope of what David had misrepresented. My mother was the next to speak, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when she was trying to understand something that seemed too complicated or troubling to accept at face value. "David, is what Maya's saying accurate? Did you join a company that was already established rather than starting one from scratch?" David looked trapped, caught between his desire to maintain the narrative he'd constructed and the growing mountain of evidence that contradicted his version of events. "Linda, it's more complicated than Maya is making it sound. Yes, there was some early technical work and a few preliminary contracts, but building that into a real business required vision and leadership that wouldn't have happened without my involvement. But that's not what you told us, my father interjected, his voice carrying the kind of disappointment that suggested he was beginning to feel personally misled. You specifically said you started the company after identifying a gap in the market and developing a solution to fill it. You never mentioned joining an existing business. The conversation was spiraling beyond David's ability to control it, and I could see him calculating whether there was any way to salvage the situation or whether he needed to shift to damage control mode. But the evidence was too clear and too comprehensive to be explained away with vague references to complexity and nuance. Jessica had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she turned to look directly at David with an expression that was equal parts hurt and anger. You lied to me, she said simply. All those stories about taking the leap to start your own company, about the sleepless nights and the risk and the uncertainty of building something from nothing. You lied about all of it. I didn't lie, David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I simplified some of the details, but the essential truth is that I took a significant risk to join a startup and helped build it into something successful. Simplified the details? Jessica's voice was rising now, her hurt transforming into something that looked very much like fury. You told me you were an entrepreneur who built a company from scratch. You let me believe that your success was the result of your vision and hard work and brilliant business instincts. You let our entire family believe that Maya was lucky to be working for such an innovative leader. The pain in her voice was obvious, and I felt a wave of sympathy for my sister despite my own anger at the situation. Jessica had fallen in love with someone she thought she knew, only to discover that the person she'd been dating was largely a fiction constructed around half-truths and strategic omissions. Jessica, please, David said, reaching for her hand across the table. None of this changes how I feel about you or what we've built together. The company is successful, we're both financially secure, and we can have the life we've been planning. The details of how it all started don't really matter now. But Jessica pulled her hand away, and I could see that the details mattered very much to her. Of course they matter, David. If you lied about something this fundamental, what else? Have you lied about? How am I supposed to trust anything you've told me about your life or your character or your values? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I realized that what had started as a business dispute was rapidly becoming something much more personal and devastating. David wasn't just losing credibility as a professional, he was losing the woman he'd claimed to love because of the deceptions he'd used to build his public image. Maybe we should take a break, my mother suggested nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the level of conflict that had erupted around her carefully planned birthday celebration. This seems like something you all might want to discuss privately. But I wasn't ready to let David retreat to private conversations where he could spin new narratives and continue the pattern of misrepresentation that had brought us to this point. Actually, Mom, I think this is exactly the kind of conversation that should happen publicly. David has been making public claims about his role in founding CloudSync for over a year now. If those claims are inaccurate, people deserve to know the truth. I stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the string lights my father had hung so carefully for this celebration. The irony wasn't lost on me that what was supposed to be a birthday party highlighting my 30th year had become the moment when I finally stopped allowing other people to define my achievements and contributions. The IPO process is going to require complete transparency about ownership structure and founding contributions, I continued, turning back to face the table. Investment bankers are going to want to understand exactly who built what and when. They're going to want to verify the technical innovations that justify our valuation projections. David's version of our origin story isn't going to survive that level of scrutiny. David was looking increasingly desperate now, his confident CEO persona completely abandoned in favor of something that looked very much like panic. Maya, you're talking about destroying everything we've built together. The IPO, The company's reputation, the relationships we've developed with clients and investors. Is proving a point really worth all of that? I'm not destroying anything, I replied calmly. I'm simply insisting on telling the truth about what we've actually built and who built it. If that threatens the company's reputation or our investor relationships, then those relationships were based on false premises to begin with. The conversation had reached a point where there was no possibility of retreat or compromise. The truth was finally fully visible, and everyone at the table was going to have to decide how to respond to it. For my part, I felt lighter than I had in months, finally free from the exhausting burden of maintaining fictions that served everyone's interests except my own. Jessica, I said gently, I'm sorry this is happening at your engagement announcement. You deserve better than finding out this way that the person you're planning to marry has been misrepresenting fundamental aspects of his professional life. But I couldn't let you make major life decisions based on information that simply isn't accurate. Jessica looked at me with tears in her eyes, but also with something that might have been gratitude. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. I needed to know who I was really planning to marry. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light one more time as she twisted it absently, and I wondered if she was already beginning to question everything else David had told her about. Their future together. The successful tech entrepreneur who could afford a dream wedding and a comfortable life had just been revealed as someone whose success was largely borrowed from someone else's innovations and hard work. David made one last attempt to salvage the situation. This doesn't have to change anything between us, Jessica. The company is still successful, the IPO is still happening, and we can still have the life we've been planning. Maya's role in the technical development doesn't diminish what we've built together personally. But Jessica was already shaking her head, the diamond catching the light as she moved. It changes everything, David. Because if you could lie about something this important, if you could let my entire family believe something that wasn't true, then I don't know who you really are. And I can't marry someone I don't know. The finality in her voice suggested that the engagement announcement that had begun the evening was about to be followed by a very different kind of announcement. The birthday party that was supposed to celebrate my 30th year was instead becoming the night when everything I thought I knew about my family and my business partnership was fundamentally transformed. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt completely comfortable with the chaos I had created by simply insisting on telling the truth. The weight of Jessica's words settled over the table like a heavy blanket, muffling the sound of David's sharp intake of breath and the distant traffic from the street beyond my parents' backyard. The engagement ring that had sparkled so brilliantly just an hour earlier now seemed to mock the ruins of what had been presented as a perfect evening, a perfect announcement, a perfect future. David's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track, from shock to desperation to something that looked dangerously close to rage. Jessica, you're overreacting. You're letting Maya's jealousy destroy what we have together. Can't you see what she's doing? She's always resented that I've been more successful at the business side of things, and now she's trying to sabotage our relationship out of spite. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and I felt every pair of eyes at the table turn toward me, waiting to see how I would respond to being characterized as a jealous saboteur. For a moment, the old instinct to apologize and retreat kicked in, the familiar pattern of avoiding conflict by accepting blame I didn't deserve. But something had fundamentally shifted inside me during the past hour. The version of myself that would have absorbed David's accusations and tried to smooth over the conflict had been replaced by someone who was finally done accepting other people's convenient fictions about who I was and what I'd contributed. Jealousy, I repeated slowly, tasting the word like something bitter. You think I'm jealous of your success at the business side of things. David, what exactly do you think the business side of things entails? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the business side of things primarily involved taking credit for work you didn't do and telling stories about achievements that weren't yours. Uncle Tom cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly, wishing he could disappear from what had become an intensely personal confrontation. "Maybe this is something you folks should work out privately," he suggested diplomatically. "No," Jessica said firmly, her voice stronger than it had been since the revelations began. "I want to hear this. I want to understand exactly what David's role in the company actually was versus what he told me it was. Because apparently I've been planning to marry someone I don't know at all." David shot me a look of pure venom before turning back to Jessica with an expression that was clearly meant to appear wounded and misunderstood. "Jessica, sweetheart, you know who I am. You've seen me work. You've watched me build relationships with clients and investors. You've been there for the late nights and the stressful meetings and all the pressure that comes with running a company." Maya's trying to rewrite history because she's angry that I've gotten more recognition than she has. "Running a company," I interjected, pulling up another document on my phone. "Let's talk about what running the company actually looked like. This is our organizational chart from when you joined CloudSync, David. I was listed as Chief Technology Officer and Founder. You were brought on as Chief Executive Officer. 2 different roles, both important, but with very different responsibilities and very different levels of authority." I turned the screen toward Jessica, who leaned forward, to study the document with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had personal significance. "According to this, Maya was your boss when you started working there," she said slowly. "Technically, yes," David admitted reluctantly. "But the day-to-day operations were more collaborative than the formal structure suggested. Maya focused on the technical development while I handled everything else." "Everything else," I repeated. "Let's be specific about what everything else actually meant. You handled sales meetings that I had already set up with clients who were interested in technology that I had already developed. You managed investor relationships with people who were interested in patents that I had already filed. You gave presentations about innovations that I had already created and implemented." Cousin Ryan was looking at David with something approaching disgust. "Dude, that's not business development. That's just taking credit for someone else's work and hoping nobody notices." "It's more complicated than that," David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maya's brilliant technically, but she doesn't understand the complexities of market positioning and investor relations and strategic partnerships. Someone had to translate her innovations into business opportunities." "Someone did," I agreed. "Me. I identified the market opportunities. I developed the client relationships. I structured the partnerships that allowed us to scale. You came on board after the business model was already established and the growth trajectory was already clear. Your job was to execute a strategy that was already working, not to create something from nothing." The conversation was interrupted by my mother's phone buzzing loudly against the table. She glanced at it apologetically before her expression shifted to surprise. "It's Marcus Williams," she said, looking at me questioningly. "He says it's urgent and about the company." Marcus. I'd forgotten that I told him something had come up at the family dinner. He'd probably been trying to reach me about the Meridian contract or some other technical issue that couldn't wait until morning. But the timing of his call felt almost prophetic, another piece of evidence about who actually handled the important aspects of CloudSync's operations. "I should take this," I said, accepting the phone from my mother. "Marcus manages our technical development team. If he's calling on a Saturday night, it's probably important." "Maya," Marcus's voice came through clearly in the sudden quiet around the table. "Sorry to bother you at dinner, but we just got word that the Meridian contract is being accelerated. They want to implement the new security protocols next month instead of waiting until the new year. I need to know if you want me to start modifying the encryption parameters now, or if we should wait until you can review the specifications on Monday." The question was clearly directed to me as the technical authority on the project, and I, Could see David's face tighten as he realized that Marcus wasn't calling him for guidance on our most important client relationship. "Go ahead and start the modifications," I replied. "Use the hybrid approach we discussed last week, but make sure you're documenting every change for the patent applications. I'll review everything first thing Monday morning." "Got it. And Maya?" The preliminary IPO documentation came in from the lawyers today. They want to schedule a meeting next week to go over the technical disclosures and ownership structures. "Should I set something up for you and David together, or do you want to handle the technical side separately?" The question was innocent enough, but it landed like another bombshell in the context of our current conversation. The lawyers handling our IPO preparation clearly understood that I was the technical authority and primary owner, regardless of what David had been telling the world about his role in the company. "Schedule it for Tuesday afternoon," I said. "And yes, we'll need to handle the technical disclosures and ownership documentation together. There are some misconceptions that need to be cleared up before we proceed." When I ended the call and handed the phone back to my mother, the silence around the table was thick with implications. Everyone had just heard Marcus defer to my authority on technical decisions, and lawyers request my input on ownership structures, providing real-time confirmation of everything I'd been saying about my role in the company. "So the lawyers think Maya's the primary owner too," Jessica observed quietly. "And your technical team reports to her, not to you." David was looking increasingly cornered, his confident CEO persona completely abandoned in favor of something that looked very much like desperation. "The legal structure doesn't reflect the real working relationship," he said weakly. "Maya may own more shares on paper, but the practical leadership of the company has been collaborative." "Collaborative," I repeated, finally allowing some of my accumulated frustration to show in my voice. "Is that what you call it when you give interviews to business journals without mentioning my name? Is that what you call it when you pitch to investors using slides that describe innovations as your personal achievements? Is that what you call it when you tell my own family that they should be grateful for the opportunities you've given me?" The last accusation seemed to hit hardest, and I could see my parents exchanging glances that suggested they were remembering specific conversations where David had positioned himself as my benefactor rather than my business partner. "David," my father said slowly, "did you really let us think that Maya was working for you rather than with you?" The question was asked with the kind of careful control that suggested my father was trying very hard not to lose his temper. Robert, Chen had built his contracting business on principles of honest dealing and straight talk, and the idea that someone had deliberately misled his family about fundamental facts was clearly triggering his sense of justice. "It wasn't deliberate," David protested. "It's just that when people asked about the company, it was easier to give them a simplified version rather than getting into complicated explanations about technical contributions and ownership structures." "Easier for who?" Jessica asked sharply. "Easier for you to take credit for work you didn't do? Easier for you to position yourself as more successful than you actually are? Easier for you to impress my family with achievements that weren't yours?" The hurt in her voice was obvious, and I realized that Jessica was processing not just the business deceptions, but also the personal implications of what David's lies meant for their relationship. She'd fallen in love with someone who had systematically misrepresented his professional achievements in order to appear more impressive and successful than he actually was. "Jessica, please," David said, reaching for her hand again. "You know who I am beyond the business stuff. You know how I treat you, how much I love you, how committed I am to our future together. The details about the company don't change any of that." But Jessica pulled away from his touch, and I could see that the details about the company changed everything for her. "The details about the company tell me that you're willing to lie about fundamental aspects of your life in order to get what you want. They tell me that you're comfortable taking credit for other people's work and letting other people believe things that aren't true. How am I supposed to trust you with marriage and children and major life decisions when you've been lying about something this important?" The engagement ring caught the light again as she twisted it on her finger. and I could see her looking at it with new eyes, as if seeing it for the first time as a symbol of promises made by someone whose truthfulness was now in serious question. David was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of defeat that suggested he understood the situation was beyond salvage. I never meant for it to go this far. When I first started telling people about the company, I simplified some of the details because it seemed easier than explaining the complex technical and financial arrangements. But then the story took on a life of its own, and people started making assumptions that I didn't correct. Didn't correct, I said, or actively encouraged, because there's a significant difference between passively allowing misconceptions and actively promoting false narratives about your achievements. David's face flushed with something that might have been shame or anger or both. Fine, yes, I encouraged some of the misconceptions. I liked being seen as a successful entrepreneur. I liked the respect and recognition that came with being perceived as the founder of an innovative tech company. But that doesn't mean I don't deserve some credit for the work I've done. You do deserve credit for the work you've done, I agreed. You've been an effective CEO, and you've contributed to the company's growth in meaningful ways. But there's a difference between getting credit for your actual contributions and claiming credit for the entire enterprise. There's a difference between being recognized as a valuable team member and positioning yourself as the primary architect of someone else's innovations. The conversation had reached a point where the fundamental dishonesty of David's position was undeniable, and I could see him struggling to find any way to justify or minimize what he'd done. But the evidence was too comprehensive, and the contradictions too obvious to be explained away. Jessica slowly pulled the engagement ring off her finger and set it on the table between us, where it caught the string lights and threw tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. The gesture was final and devastating, a physical manifestation of dreams being abandoned and promises being rescinded. I can't marry someone who would lie about something this fundamental, she said quietly. I can't build a life with someone I don't trust to tell me the truth about who he really is and what he's really accomplished. I thought I was engaged to a successful entrepreneur who'd built something amazing. Instead, I find out I'm engaged to someone who took credit for my sister's work and let my entire family believe a story that wasn't true. David stared at the ring sitting on the table as if he couldn't quite comprehend what it represented. Jessica, you're throwing away everything we've planned together. The wedding, the house we were going to buy, the life we were building. Is proving a point really worth all of that? It's not about proving a point, Jessica replied firmly. It's about honesty and integrity, and being able to trust the person you're planning to spend your life with. You've shown me that you're willing to lie about fundamental aspects of your identity in order to appear more impressive than you actually are. How could I ever trust you with anything important again? The finality in her voice seemed to break. Something inside David, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked genuinely devastated rather than angry or defensive. I made mistakes, he said quietly. I let the situation get out of hand and I should have corrected the misconceptions earlier. But I do love you, Jessica. That part was never a lie. Maybe you do love me, Jessica acknowledged. But you loved the idea of impressing me and my family with achievements that weren't yours more than you loved me enough to be honest with me. And that tells me everything I need to know about what kind of partner you would have been. The engagement that had been announced with such joy and excitement just a few hours earlier was officially over, ended by revelations that had transformed a birthday celebration into a reckoning with truth and consequences. But as I looked around the table at my family's faces, I realized that something important had been gained in the process. My parents were looking at me with new understanding and respect, finally seeing me clearly instead of through the distorting lens of David's narrative. Uncle Tom and Aunt Carol were nodding approvingly, clearly impressed by my technical achievements and business acumen. Cousin Ryan was practically glowing with admiration for innovations he now understood were genuinely mine. Most importantly, Jessica was looking at me with gratitude and relief, recognizing that what could have been seen as sabotage was actually an act of love and protection. I had saved her from making a life-altering decision based on false information, even though doing so had required destroying the comfortable fictions that had made everyone's life easier. "Maya," my mother said quietly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We should have asked more questions and made fewer assumptions about what was happening with your company. You've accomplished something truly remarkable, and we should have been celebrating your achievements instead of giving credit to someone else." The acknowledgement was more meaningful than I had expected it to be, and I felt years of accumulated frustration and invisibility beginning to dissolve in the face of genuine recognition and understanding. "Thank you," I said simply. I know this wasn't how anyone expected the evening to go, but I couldn't let the misconceptions continue indefinitely. The IPO process is going to require complete transparency about everything, and it seemed better to address the truth now rather than having it come out during due diligence. David gathered himself enough to make one final attempt at salvage. "Maya, we still have to work together going forward. The IPO, the company operations, the client relationships. We can't let personal conflicts destroy everything we've built." "You're right," I agreed. "We do have to work together, and we will. But we're going to work together honestly, with clear understanding of who contributed what and who deserves credit for which achievements. The days of comfortable fictions and strategic ambiguity are over." As the evening wound down and the extended family began to make their goodbyes, I found myself standing in my parents' kitchen with Jessica, helping to clear dishes and process the emotional wreckage of what had transpired. "Are you okay?" I asked her, noting the exhaustion and strain in her expression. "I'm hurt and embarrassed and angry," she replied honestly. "But I'm also grateful. Better to find out who he really is now than after we were married and had children together. You saved me from making a huge mistake, even though it cost you personally to do it." "It didn't cost me anything that mattered," I said. "Telling the truth about my work and my achievements isn't a cost. It's a liberation. I've been invisible in my own life for too long." Jessica smiled sadly as she rinsed cake plates in the sink. "You were never invisible to me. I always knew you were brilliant and accomplished. I just didn't understand how much more brilliant and accomplished you were than David was letting anyone see." 3 months later, CloudSync's IPO was successfully completed with a valuation that exceeded even our most optimistic projections. The investment bankers were particularly impressed by the technical innovations and patent portfolio that formed the company's core value proposition. David remained as CEO, but with a much clearer understanding of the actual ownership structure and contribution hierarchy. Our working relationship was professional but distant, marked by the kind of careful politeness that follows major betrayals. Jessica started dating an environmental lawyer she met through a hiking group, someone whose achievements were modest but genuine, and whose honesty was refreshing after her experience with David's elaborate fictions. My parents became some of my strongest advocates, finally understanding and celebrating the magnitude of what I had accomplished in building CloudSync from nothing into a major technology company. The birthday party that had begun as a celebration of my 30th year had ended as something much more significant. The moment when I finally stopped allowing other people to define my worth and started insisting on recognition for work that was genuinely mine. Sometimes the most important gift you can give yourself is simply the courage to tell the truth about who you are and what you've accomplished, regardless of how inconvenient that truth might be for other people. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.